I was standing in my own kitchen, making coffee the way I had every morning for 31 years, when my husband walked in with a lawyer and told me I had 72 hours to vacate the premises. 72 hours. After 3 decades of marriage. After raising 2 children in this house. After nursing him through his heart surgery, his mother's funeral, his business failures. 72 hours. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 63 years old. And that Tuesday morning in April, my entire world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Let me back up a little. My husband, Richard, and I met in 1992 at a charity gala in Boston. I was a music teacher at a private school. He was an up-and-coming real estate developer. We married 8 months later, and I thought I had found my forever person. I gave up my teaching career when our first child was born because Richard insisted. He wanted a traditional household, a wife who would be there for the children, for him, for his business dinners and golf club events. And I did it. For 31 years, I did it. I organized his life. I raised our children, Thomas and Christine. I smiled at his clients, remembered their wives' names, their children's birthdays. I made our house a home. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own career, my own identity for this family. And now, at 63, I was being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. The lawyer, a young man who couldn't even look me in the eye, explained that Richard had filed for divorce, that he had, through some legal maneuvering I didn't understand, managed to classify the house and most of our assets as his separate property because of how they were originally titled, that I was entitled to very little. Very little. After 31 years, Richard stood there with his arms crossed, watching me like I was a stranger, like I was an inconvenience he was finally getting around to dealing with. "Where is this coming from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Richard, what happened? What did I do?" He sighed, like my question was exhausting him. "Eleanor," he said, "I've met someone who makes me feel alive again. I haven't felt alive in this marriage for years." He'd met someone. Her name, I would later learn, was Brittany. She was 34 years old, a yoga instructor he'd met at his gym. She was younger than our daughter. I asked him, "How long?" He shrugged. 2 years. Maybe a little more. 2 years. He'd been lying to me, betraying me, for over 2 years. All those business trips, all those late nights at the office, all lies. The next 72 hours were a blur of tears, phone calls, and packing. Our children were stunned. Thomas, who lived in Seattle, immediately offered to fly home. Christine, in Chicago, was on the phone with me for hours, crying, raging, trying to make sense of what her father had done. But there was nothing to make sense of. Richard had decided I was no longer useful to him, and he had found a legal way to throw me away. On my last night in that house, I walked through every room. The living room where we'd celebrated 30 Christmases, the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, the bedroom where I'd slept beside him for 3 decades, not knowing he was dreaming of someone else. I stopped in the small study at the back of the house. This had been my space, the one room Richard never really entered. My books, my old sheet music from my teaching days, my grandmother's writing desk that I'd inherited when she passed. I sat down at that desk and cried. When I opened the drawer to look for tissues, my hand brushed against something at the very back. An envelope, old and yellowed, that I'd completely forgotten about. It was from my father. My father, James, had passed away 12 years earlier. He'd been a quiet man, a dreamer who never quite found his footing in the practical world. He'd worked various jobs over the years, a bookkeeper here, a clerk there, but his real passion had been music. He'd spent decades writing songs, melodies, lyrics, hundreds of them. He'd even recorded some in the 60s and 70s with a small studio in Nashville, though nothing ever came of it, or so we all thought. Before he died, he'd given me this envelope and told me to keep it safe, that someday it might be important. I'd tucked it away and honestly forgotten about it. My father's dreams had never amounted to anything real. At least, that's what I'd always believed. Inside the envelope was a business card, old and faded. Sullivan and Associates, Music Publishing and Rights Management, Nashville, Tennessee, and clipped to it was a handwritten note from my father. Eleanor, The note read, "If you ever need help, call this number. Ask for Margaret Sullivan. Tell her you're James Whitfield's daughter. She'll know what to do. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more in this life, sweetheart. But I hope I've left you something. Love, Dad." I stared at that note for a long time. My father had died with almost nothing. A small apartment, some furniture, boxes of sheet music that my siblings and I had divided among ourselves, more out of sentiment than any belief they were worth anything. What could he possibly have left me? The next morning, I loaded my suitcase and 3 boxes of personal belongings into my 15-year-old Honda Civic. That was what I was leaving with after 31 years of marriage. A car, some clothes, and my grandmother's desk, which I'd had to fight Richard to keep. I had $847 in my personal checking account. My credit cards were in Richard's name. My phone was on his plan. I was 63 years old, hadn't worked in over 3 decades, and I was essentially homeless. I drove to a budget motel outside of Boston. $49 a night, which felt like a fortune given my circumstances. I sat on that thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and wondered how my life had come to this. The business card was still in my purse. The next morning, I called the number. A receptionist answered. "Sullivan and Associates, how may I direct your call?" My voice was shaky. "I'm looking for Margaret Sullivan. My name is Eleanor Whitfield Mitchell. My father was James Whitfield, and he told me to call." There was a pause. Then the receptionist's voice changed, became warmer. "Oh my goodness. Please hold, Mrs. Mitchell. Miss Sullivan will want to speak with you immediately." Immediately? That seemed odd for a business card that was over a decade old. 2 minutes later, a woman's voice came on the line. Strong, professional, but with an undercurrent of emotion I didn't understand. "Eleanor, I've been hoping you'd call for 12 years. I'm so glad you finally did." "I'm sorry," I said, confused. "I don't understand. Do you know who I am?" "Oh, honey," Margaret Sullivan replied. "I know exactly who you are. You're James Whitfield's daughter. And I've been holding something for you that you need to know about. Can you come to Nashville?" I looked around my motel room, at my suitcase, at my $847 checking account. "I don't know if I can afford to," I admitted, my voice breaking with shame. "I'm in a difficult situation right now." "Don't you worry about that," Margaret said firmly. "I'm going to have my assistant book you a flight and a hotel. It's on the company. And Eleanor, bring identification, proof that you're James's daughter. This is important." I didn't understand any of it, but I had nothing left to lose. 2 days later, I was in Nashville, sitting in the offices of Sullivan and Associates, a beautiful old building on Music Row. Margaret Sullivan was in her late 70s, a formidable woman with silver hair and sharp eyes behind designer glasses. She took my hand and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as reverent. "You look just like him," she said. "Your father was one of the most talented songwriters I ever knew." I blinked. "I'm sorry? My father? He never had any success with his music. It was just a hobby." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Eleanor, your father was too humble for his own good, and honestly, the timing of his career was terrible. He wrote songs in the 60s and 70s that were ahead of their time, but he did record them, and he did copyright them. And most importantly, he did register them with us." She pulled out a thick file folder. "Your father's catalog includes 247 original compositions, songs that he wrote the music and lyrics for, songs that he owned completely." 247? That's impressive, I suppose, but I still don't understand why this matters. Margaret took a deep breath. "Eleanor, in 2015, 3 years after your father passed, one of his songs was used in a commercial. A car commercial. It was a small sync license, but it got attention. Then, in 2018, a popular artist covered another one of his songs. It went platinum." I felt the room tilt slightly. "What?" "Since then," Margaret continued, "there's been a surge of interest in your father's catalog. His songs have been used in 14 commercials, 3 movies, 2 television series, and covered by 7 different artists. One of his songs became the theme for a Netflix series that ran for 4 seasons. I couldn't breathe. I literally could not breathe. Margaret slid a piece of paper across the desk to me. This is the current value of your father's catalog, based on recent offers from major music publishers who want to acquire it. I looked at the number. And then I looked again. And then I started crying. $18 million. My father's songs, his life's work that we all thought had come to nothing, was worth $18 million. There's more, Margaret said gently. Your father set up a trust before he died. Everything in his catalog was placed in that trust, with you as the sole beneficiary. Me? But my brother? My sister? Shouldn't they? Margaret shook her head. Your father was very specific. He told me that your brother and sister both received their inheritances from your mother's side when she passed, and that you gave up your own musical dreams to support your husband's career. He wanted you to have this. He said you would need it someday. She paused. It seems he was right. I thought about my father, his quiet smile, the way he used to hum while doing dishes, the way he'd encouraged my love of music when I was young, before Richard convinced me that teaching wasn't prestigious enough for his wife. Dad, I whispered. Oh, Dad. The next few months were a whirlwind. I hired a lawyer, a real one, a shark named Patricia Wong who specialized in divorce cases. When she reviewed my situation, she was furious. Your husband hid assets, she told me. He transferred property without your knowledge or consent. He's been planning this for years. We're going to destroy him. And we did. Patricia filed counterclaims that exposed every shady thing Richard had done. The house that was supposedly his separate property? Turns out he'd used marital funds to pay the mortgage for decades. The business assets he'd claimed were separate? There was clear evidence of commingling. And Brittany, the yoga instructor? She'd been receiving gifts purchased with money that was half mine. When Richard's lawyer learned that I had suddenly come into significant wealth and could afford to fight indefinitely, the tone of the negotiations changed dramatically. Richard, it turned out, was not nearly as financially secure as he'd pretended. His business was struggling. He'd been counting on getting rid of me cheaply so he could start fresh. The final divorce settlement awarded me 60% of the marital assets, including the house. The house where Richard was now living with Brittany, the house he'd thrown me out of. On the day the settlement was finalized, I had a decision to make. I could move back into that house and force Richard and his mistress to leave. The thought was tempting, incredibly tempting. But I didn't. I didn't want that house anymore. It was full of memories, yes, but they were memories of a life that had been a lie. A marriage where I had given everything and my husband had been secretly planning my disposal for years. I sold Richard the house at full market value. He had to liquidate his retirement accounts to afford it. And then I walked away. I bought a beautiful Victorian home in Savannah, Georgia. I'd always loved Savannah, ever since visiting as a young woman. The moss-draped oaks, the historic squares, the sense of history and beauty everywhere you looked. But I didn't just buy a house. I also bought an old building downtown, a former dance hall from the 1920s, and I began renovating it. When my children asked what I was doing, I told them the truth. I was building a music school, a place where young people, especially young women, could pursue their musical dreams without having to give them up for anyone or anything. I was calling it the James Whitfield Center for Musical Arts. My father spent his whole life creating beautiful music that no one heard, I explained to Christine over the phone. And I spent my whole life silencing my own music for a man who didn't deserve it. This center is going to make sure other women don't have to make that choice. Christine flew down to help me plan the grand opening. Thomas came too, bringing his wife and my 2 grandchildren. We stood in the renovated building, now filled with practice rooms, recording studios, and a small performance hall, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The day before the grand opening, I received a phone call. It was Richard. "Eleanor," he said, his voice small in a way I'd never heard before. "I need to talk to you." "I don't think we have anything to say to each other, Richard. Please. Just 5 minutes." I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I was curious. Maybe some part of me, after 31 years, still cared what he had to say. We met at a coffee shop in Savannah. He looked terrible. Older, worn down, defeated. "Brittany left me," he said without preamble. Turns out she was more interested in the lifestyle than in me. When the money got tight, she found someone else. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. And I was surprised to find that I meant it. Not because I cared about Richard anymore, but because no one deserves to be used like that. Not even him. He looked at me with something like desperation. Eleanor, I made a terrible mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. I was a fool. I threw away everything that mattered for someone who never cared about me at all. I sipped my coffee and considered his words. Yes, I finally said. You did. His face crumpled. Is there any chance? He began. I held up my hand. Richard, let me stop you right there. There is no chance. None. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal that you planned and executed over years. You looked me in the eye every day for 2 years while you were lying to me. You hired lawyers to figure out how to leave me with nothing. You had me thrown out of my own home like I was garbage. I stood up and gathered my purse. I forgive you, I said, because carrying around hatred for you would only hurt me, and I'm done letting you hurt me. But we are finished, Richard. Forever. I hope you find peace somehow, but you'll find it without me. I walked out of that coffee shop and I never looked back. The grand opening of the James Whitfield Center for Musical Arts was everything I had dreamed. Local musicians performed. Students who had already signed up for classes sang and played instruments. Margaret Sullivan flew in from Nashville and gave a speech about my father's legacy. And when I stood at the podium to address the crowd, I saw my children, my grandchildren, my new friends in Savannah, and I felt my father's presence somehow, like a warm hand on my shoulder. My father always believed in the power of music, I said into the microphone. He believed it could heal, inspire, and transform. He spent his life creating songs, not for fame or money, but because he couldn't not create them. It was who he was. I paused, feeling tears prick at my eyes. 6 months ago, I had nothing. I had been thrown away by someone I trusted. I had no money, no home, no idea what my future held. And then I found a business card my father had given me years before, and everything changed. I looked out at the faces before me. Many of them young women, students who would learn and grow in this space. Some people will tell you that your dreams aren't practical, that you should give them up for security, for stability, for someone else's vision of what your life should be. And sometimes you might have to. Life is complicated, but never stop believing in those dreams. Never stop nurturing them, even if it's just in secret, even if it's just in the pages of a notebook no one else sees, because you never know when those dreams might save you. The applause was thunderous. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I walked through the empty center alone. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. I stopped in the recording studio, where my father's framed photograph hung on the wall. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I had stopped believing in myself. Thank you for leaving me something that wasn't about money, but about love, about legacy, about the person you always knew I could be." I pressed my hand to my heart, where a small locket hung on a chain. Inside was a photo of my father and me when I was 7 years old, sitting at a piano together. He was teaching me to play Clair de Lune. It was the first song I ever learned. Tomorrow, the first class would begin. Tomorrow, young women would walk through these doors and start pursuing their dreams. Tomorrow, my father's music would be taught and played and loved by a new generation. But tonight, I was just Eleanor, a 63-year-old woman who had survived betrayal, found unexpected grace, and discovered that it's never too late to begin again. The next morning, I woke up early in my beautiful Savannah home. I made coffee, sat on my porch overlooking a moss-draped oak, and watched the sun rise over this city I now called home. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Sullivan. "Your father's song, Finding Home, just got placed in a new romantic comedy. And there's interest from a major artist in recording an entire album of his material. Catalog value just increased to $24 million. Thought you'd want to know. Your dad would be so proud of you, Eleanor. I know I am." I smiled and set down my phone. $24 million. It was an almost incomprehensible number. And yet, sitting there in the morning light, watching birds flutter through the oak branches, I realized that the money, as life-changing as it had been, wasn't really the gift my father had given me. The real gift was this moment, this peace, this sense of purpose and possibility that I hadn't felt since I was a young woman with my whole life ahead of me. Richard had tried to take everything from me. He'd nearly succeeded, but he couldn't take my father's love. He couldn't take the dreams that had been sleeping inside me for 30 years, waiting for their moment to wake up. I was 63 years old. I had lost my marriage, my home, and everything I thought I knew about my life, and I had never been happier. Because sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that happens to you. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. Sometimes, the darkest night leads to the most beautiful dawn. And sometimes, a father's love, tucked away in an old envelope, can save your life when you need saving the most. So wherever you are, whatever you're going through, remember this: it's never too late. Your story isn't over. And you never know what unexpected gift might be waiting for you, tucked away in a drawer, waiting for the moment when you need it most. My name is Eleanor, and this is my true story. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next one.